I worked in what I like to call the PR economy. Answer the client, soothe the client, never let the client feel stupid for not knowing something they should have known. My official title was account coordinator, which translated into a day full of gently phrased emails, crisis-averting phone calls, and quarterly theater. The meetings where our clients' reps would trundle in, sit under the office's omnipresent fluorescence, and let us prove we were worth every penny of their retainer. Those meetings happened like clockwork, every 3 months. They were my Super Bowl, my audition, and, not coincidentally, the thing my yearly bonus hinged on. I was young, preppy, and annoyingly organized. I wore sensible heels because I liked the way they made me feel taller than my anxiety, button-downs that were not quite buttoned to the collar because life is a compromise, and a trench that had seen me through 3 promotions and 1 breakup. I took pride in the niceties that made clients trust us: a calm voice, an agenda printed and folded into crisp thirds, a project timeline with dates that actually lined up. Reputation was currency in my role, and I treated it like Bitcoin, volatile if mishandled, worth a lot if you paid attention. Which is why, for 8 months, the woman who sat nearest the front door made my job feel like walking a tightrope over a blinking slot machine. She had pink and platinum blonde highlights that looked like someone had painted candy floss onto her head and then decided to go medieval with the color. A silver hoop sat in her nose the way a stubborn beetle sits on a leaf. Not flashy, but impossible to ignore. Her tattoos crawled up from below the collar of her shirt, teased in and out of her sleeves, and disappeared at the neckline, a riot of black and color that, if you weren't careful, read like a Pinterest board for someone who'd briefly considered becoming a pirate. Heavy makeup meant her eyes were a study in noir every day. I watched clients glance at her like they'd seen a very stylish thundercloud. She favored tank tops that left her midriff visible and straps exposed, which was not the norm in our office. Not because we had a sartorially repressive culture, but because most of our staff actually read the business casual memo the same way their phone battery reads 20% and decides to change behavior accordingly. She sat right by the entrance, which meant she was one of the first faces anyone from the outside saw. For people who cared about first impressions, and our clients cared, that proximity mattered. I noticed the looks. It started as a pattern you could barely see: a slower smile from a rep, a raised eyebrow, a quick sideways glance, meant to catalog whether someone matched the picture they had of a professional. Over time, it hardened into something else: open disapproval, the kind that felt like a thermostat set to judgmental. Reps would come for the meeting, do the handshake and kiss-up song, then glance past me to where she was organizing name badges or delivering coffee, and the look would ripple through them like a bad joke they weren't quite finished with. I could read the sign language of discomfort the way I could read the minutes in a calendar. Subtle, then obvious, then dangerous. The crescendo arrived on a Tuesday in late spring. We had a new rep visiting from a big client, the sort of account that paid our bills and invited our execs to golf tournaments. He was a man who made his wealth look like a tailored suit and a bored expression. We'd run through the usual: metrics, deliverables, new ideas. He leaned back, palms spread in that theatrical "I've heard it all" pose, and then, as if the thought couldn't be housed in his head any longer, he cut across the final slide and jerked his head toward the front of the office. "Wow," he said, like he was tasting a lemon. "You hire just about anybody here, huh?" The sound of the question hung in the room like a dropped plate. My first instinct was to laugh, the reflexive social laugh that smooths awkward corners. Good help is hard to find, I said with the little smile I kept in my professional kit. He didn't smile back. He raised one eyebrow, a cat smirking, and muttered, "She must be damn good at her job," as if saying it out loud performed some sort of civic duty, as if putting an exclamation point on his stereotyping made him less crude. When he left, I was angry in that specific way professionals get angry: prickly, internal, efficient. It wasn't just the insult toward a colleague. It was that one client's casual dismissal of a person's competence because of how she presented herself threatened the one thing I'd spent months cultivating: trust. If our clients started to believe we were hiring just about anybody, then I had to spend twice the time convincing them otherwise, time I didn't have, and time the company didn't want to pay for. So I did the grown-up thing I always did. I walked to the manager's office. He had been at the company long enough to own more coffee stains on his tie than the rest of us had had lunches. His idea of conflict resolution was a combination of HR forms and soothing tones that indicated he'd preferred to be somewhere that required fewer human feelings, like a bridge or a spreadsheet. I tried to be precise. I told him what I'd heard, how clients' reps reacted in meetings, and why that mattered. I didn't say the words uncomfortable or bias. Like a sledgehammer, I used them like scalpels. I reminded him, plainly and without melodrama, that we had a dress code, business casual, no facial piercings, which I double-checked because corporate loves rules but hates ambiguity, and no facial tattoos. Makeup wasn't specified, which felt like a loophole to a novelist. He listened with the kind of forehead rest that meant he was filing my words under things to consider. "I'll talk to her," he said. It was the manager's default response. He didn't say fire or write up. He said, "I'll talk to her," which was a conversation everyone imagines as gentle and clarifying and fully resolved in one 10-minute sit-down. Feeling like I'd done what was required, I went back to my desk and started drafting follow-up materials for the next client. I rehearsed answers I might have to give if someone asked whether the company cared about appearances. I did not sleep well that night. A week later, the issue didn't hover gently toward resolution. It detonated. The woman had refused. Not once or twice, but adamantly. She'd called the manager's attempt to enforce a dress code discriminatory, and she'd said it in a way that left little room for an HR-friendly middle ground. She argued that her body was her expression, that policing hair and tattoos was policing identity, and that if the company wanted to keep people who looked like her, they needed to either change the rules or stop tiptoeing around them. The manager, who suddenly seemed to be carrying the weight of 1,000 ambiguous memos, called me into a conference room. When I walked in, the fluorescent lights caught the nervousness on his face like glare on a screen. He closed the door, which in our office meant we were meant to be discreet. Not that discretion had any power against a claim as loud as discrimination. "They don't want to fire her," he said, careful and slow, like he was walking me through the terms of an insurance policy after a small flood. "But they also don't like hearing you tell them that our clients' reps have an issue with who we hire and how they present themselves." It was the sentence that smacked me with the honest, raw thing I hadn't thought through. The company was balancing between loyalty to an employee's civil claim and loyalty to a revenue stream. They were treating an individual's appearance as a bargaining chip. And me? I had become the messenger with a potentially explosive note in my hand. I felt, briefly, both guilty and justified. Guilty because the woman might as well have been a mirror showing us our own inconsistent policies. Justified because I'd been hired to protect the client relationship, and, as much as I hated the implications, I couldn't ignore the fact that clients' perceptions affected renewals, which affected people's paychecks. HR wanted to avoid a lawsuit. Sales wanted to avoid a scandal. The manager wanted to avoid being forced to pick a side. In the middle of that rotor of priorities sat me, a neat pile of agendas and a heart that wanted the office to be both fair and functional. That evening, after the meeting, I walked by her desk. She was on the phone, animated, the tattoo at her forearm twisting like a live thing when she gestured. She saw me, and for a second I thought she might flip me off or roll her eyes. Instead, she gave me a look that was sharp, not cruel, but measuring. A look that dared me to decide which planet I was on, and then yelled that I'd picked the wrong one. I left the office with that look burned into the back of my skull. My reflection in the elevator's stainless steel doors seemed smaller than usual. The stakes were no longer theoretical. This was now a problem with names and consequences, and the kind of messy human details corporate procedures never fully accounted for. And now the question wasn't just about dress code. It was about who made the rules and who had to live by them, about whether aesthetic judgment could ever be separated from actual performance, and about how far a company would go to placate the people who paid the bills. I'd raised the issue because I thought it was my job to raise it. What I hadn't anticipated was how quickly it would turn into a moral rope pull, a tug of war between reputation and autonomy, with me standing awkwardly in the middle, holding the flag. My manager's office had the kind of door that made you feel about 10 pounds heavier when it shut. Thick wood, a little brass nameplate, the kind of small theater that suggested consequences. He didn't ask me to sit. He shut the door, locked it, and then, because corporate protocol loves ritual, he said, "You two need to talk." She was already there when I walked in, arms folded like she was bracing herself against the fluorescent lights. Up close, her makeup was immaculate in a way that deserved a job title. Dramatic eyeliner that made her eyes look like film noir, a matte lip that refused to smudge. Her dark hair was pinned back, which softened the riot of color I'd only seen from across the room. For the first time, without the barriers of distance and client chatter, I noticed the small details. The curve of a tattoo along her clavicle where it met her shirt, a silver hoop that caught the light at her nose, the way her posture held a stubborn kind of pride. She was vehement from the first breath. Her voice had the low, controlled heat of someone who had rehearsed this conversation in private and intended to win. "You brought client comments to my manager like I'm a problem," she said. "You could have come to me. You decided to make me a thing in a meeting." My first instinct was to put corporate armor back on. I had spreadsheets and slides and a deadline-etched face. "I brought it to management because it affects the client relationship," I said. "It's not personal. I was trying to protect the account." "Protect the account from what?" she shot back. "From me being myself? That sentence sounds like you're trying to protect them from a human." Her anger had fissures, fatigue, and something like hurt. And it took me a second to remember there was a person behind the tattoos and the eyeliner, not an aesthetic problem to be solved. She had been working there 8 months. That meant 8 months of polite stares, subtle exclusions, and now an explicit comment from a man who thought a person's worth was a costume to be critiqued. "I didn't want to make you a problem," I said, softer. The softer tone felt novel in my own mouth, like I was experimenting with a new shoe. "I wanted to make the client situation better." She laughed then, short and incredulous. "Your make the client situation better meant I'm the reason a man with a shallow head felt comfortable saying something rude. Does it make you feel better to be the one who stands up for accounts while sidelines happen to people who don't look like your wallpaper?" The word wallpaper landed. It stung because it was true. I'd prided myself on protecting reputations, but I'd also been part of a system that made people who didn't look like the office norm feel like aberrations. The punchline of the universe, it seemed, liked irony. "This isn't about you being a person who expresses herself," I tried. "It's about how clients perceive us when they walk into the room. That perception affects revenue, and revenue affects people's jobs. I don't want anyone to lose their job over something we might be able to handle with a conversation." Her features shifted. For a moment, the anger softened into something carefully curious, like someone listening to a map and trying to find a route that didn't involve jumping off a cliff. "I know what the dress code says," she said. "I also know what my body says. Tattoos aren't unprofessional any more than a suit is. They're different. And when you told your manager, it felt like you were choosing the suit over the person." "We are not the suit," I said. "But I am responsible for making sure that the people who pay us feel like we're a safe bet. If they think hiring people who look a certain way is reckless, they'll pull the account. I don't like that answer either, but it's the answer I have to work with." He, my manager, sat there with a muted look that meant he was both glad we were talking and afraid of the outcome. This wasn't the conversation he'd imagined when he said he'd talk to her. He had, after all, hoped for a 10-minute clarification, and then we'd go back to our respective routines. The vehemence ebbed, not because one of us capitulated, but because the room got quieter, and we were, for a tiny span, simply two nervous people trying to be honest with one another. We started to negotiate the terms of a compromise, and the negotiation was the most human thing either of us had done that week. It involved small, practical covenants that made everyone's spreadsheet of anxieties look less febrile. She agreed that for client-facing meetings, she'd make a few adjustments. She wouldn't show midriff. She'd wear a blazer or a higher neck top for those rooms. She said she would take out the nose ring for external meetings and use a small stud instead, or a clear retainer if necessary. She'd keep her makeup and dark clothes, the thing that made her feel like herself, but she'd present them in a way that our clients, especially the ones with the peculiar lens of old expectations, might not trip over. I agreed to a different sort of compromise. I promised to stop being the person who forwarded complaints without first giving the person a chance to respond. I promised to put myself in the position of asking rather than telling. I said I'd speak to clients in a way that didn't flatten a person into a talking point. I also admitted I'd been defensive, tidy in my judgments, and I apologized for making her feel like a problem instead of a colleague. At one point, in the middle of the negotiation, the conversation pivoted in a direction neither of us expected. The manager excused himself to take a call, leaving us alone for a moment too long. There's a dangerous intimacy to being left alone in a room that was meant for sterile HR conversation. It's a little like pressing pause on the parts of yourself you usually keep reserved for mirrors. "I always thought you looked put together," she said, very low. Her voice lost the bristle of argument and became softer, like something rummaging through a drawer and finding a photograph. I blinked. The admission was so disarmingly out of context I almost missed it. "You do?" "Yeah," she said. "You look like you could be on a magazine's office spread, like you always know where the stapler is." She smiled, a little crooked. "And you look pretty." The word landed like a pebble in a quiet pond. I felt the heat rise. Not shame exactly, but surprise. I had assumed she saw me as the person who'd put the complaint on the table, the person who'd chosen suits and policies. It hadn't occurred to me that she might find something of value in the tidy efficiency I cultivated. "You look good," I told her back, fumbling for honest words that weren't a corporate PR statement. "Your makeup? It's bold. You know how to make an entrance." We both laughed, the tension in the room unraveling into something oddly tender. It wasn't about seduction, at least not in the way movies portray it, but there was a real human recognition between us. Two people who had been quick to place each other inside roles, professional, problem, suit, spectacle, and then realized that those roles were flimsy when compared to the person beneath. When the manager came back in, he did not look triumphant. He looked mildly relieved, like someone who'd avoided a small fire. "Glad that's done," he muttered, standing to open the door as if to let fresh air into the aftermath. We left the room with something that felt like an agreement sealed by mutual concession and a slightly less brittle rapport. In practice, it looked like this. On client days, she wore a high-neck camisole under her favorite jackets. She used a small stud in place of the hoop for external meetings, and she kept her dark, dramatic eyes and her tattoos where they belonged. Part of her, not her headline. I made myself the person who'd check in first. If a client expressed discomfort, I would address it with nuance and defend her competence out loud instead of outsourcing blame to HR. The payoff, when it came, was smaller than melodrama and therefore more satisfying. A month later at a quarterly meeting, the same client rep who'd made the first offhand remark walked in. He did his little performance of executive NY. He glanced toward the front and met her steady eye as she delivered a packet of materials with the kind of professional courtesy that makes the difference between helpful and indispensable. He nodded. He didn't make a comment. He didn't have to. The situation resolved itself in the most boringly effective way, by competence. Later that day, in the elevator, she tapped my arm and said, "Thanks for talking to me instead of about me." I told her, honestly, thanks for agreeing to meet me halfway. We didn't become best friends overnight. We weren't suddenly the kind of coworkers who brunch together on weekends. But the small bridge we'd built mattered. It made the office less of a place where people were summarized by their hair, and more of a place where someone's work could be seen for what it actually was. I felt less defensive, more curious. She felt less boxed in, more seen. If there was a moral here, Not the kind that shows up with trumpets, but the quiet neighborhood moral that sits in someone's backyard like a good fence. It was that people were both more complicated and more reasonable than our first impressions allowed. Compromise doesn't mean surrender. It can mean respect. I'd learned that defending a client didn't have to mean shrinking a person down to make a contract fit. She'd learned that sometimes, for practical reasons, wearing a blazer didn't mean selling your soul. And in the end, when our quarterly review came around, the account renewed. The client gave us a standard line about value and service, and no one at the meeting made another sideways joke. That felt like small justice. Not dramatic vindication, but the quiet payoff of a relationship doing the work it was supposed to do. I went home that night with my trench draped over my arm and a lighter step. She stayed late, the dark of her eyeliner making her look like a small eclipse at her desk. We exchanged a look that said, without speaking the words, we both did the grown-up thing. The office, as offices do, moved forward. People still had their preferences, clients still had their biases, but there was one less person in the company who felt like a problem to be fixed, and that made the space between professional courtesy and human decency feel just wide enough to walk through without tripping.